But first, how can we be serious about combating the rising threat of terrorism in this country if we can't even be honest about the type of threat we face? Yesterday, ASIO boss Mike Burgess raised Australia's domestic threat level from possible to probable. But there were a lot of weasel words from the government around adequately describing the nature of the threats we face. Despite obvious tensions since October 7, including a knife attack in a Sydney church and the arrest of terror suspects, politicians seem loath to call out Islamist terrorism. Even religiously motivated terror, well, that phrase seems too hard. Instead, as Greg Sheridan pointed out in The Australian in his column today, that we get a whole lot of nebulous terms like politically motivated violence, which could literally describe anything. Joining me now, very happy he's back, Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann. Well, Chris, we are still, despite your break, you haven't come back at better times, we are still in troubled times. These discussions about terrorism and all the risks we face, the debate in the UK about what is driving people to riot in the streets, the divisions in the community that are decades old, don't we have to be honest when it comes to discussing this and understanding then why some people are motivated to try and kill others?
I think we do, Peter, and to give Mike Burgess his due, and I am a great respecter of the man, and I'm glad that he's been reappointed. He's been very clear about this in the past at a Senate Estimates Committee earlier this year. He said that 70% of the investigations were on religiously motivated terror and that Sunni extremism was the major concern in the security space. So I think he's been quite clear about that in the past. I have actually asked ASIO to explain this year why it was that they're starting to use terms like politically motivated terror and religiously motivated terror. And their argument is that the base of concern has broadened quite a bit in recent times. And they point, by the way, to the shootings in Queensland, which was a terror shooting in their estimation, was done by Christians. So I do understand why they are broadening the base and why they're bringing in new terms. And now it seems that concerns are on all fronts. But I don't think you should hide from the fact that when it comes to the major concern that Australia has about the kind of terrorism which would result in mass killings is Sunni extremism. And then you can say, but by the way, there are a whole lot of other areas that we're concerned about as well.
What about the discussion I just had with James Patterson about this move by Labor to grant permanency to a couple of thousand visas that are granted on a temporary basis for people out of Gaza, when we know, and the government admits, they're unable to security check visa holders as they should?
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, is that the Labor Party finds itself in an extremely difficult position because of its own base, because of its own membership, which now is largely pro-Palestinian. I think there's been a big change over time when we've seen, of course, since when I was growing up back in the 1960s and 70s, there was no bigger supporter of the State of Israel than Labor. The Labor Party's history, in fact, is that it was the party of government at the time that Israel was established as a state, and Doc Evatt was the person who shepherded that through the General Assembly. The Labor Party used to be very, very proud of that. Now they appear to be ashamed of their past and are very concerned about a couple of things. It's the rise of the Greens, which is pushing them to this position, and also its own base. And also, I'd say too, probably its own caucus now is very pro-Palestine. So we've seen a significant shift. So there's a difficulty for it on that front. And then there's a difficulty in the streets of Western Sydney, where they see a rise of the number of Muslims that are voting and may well vote on this issue. So I think that you look to that as a cause as to why it would be that we're seeing some of those decisions.
Well, talk to me about the UK and what you're seeing with these riots. Obviously it's the far right. I do make the point that they're very happy to use the term far right, particularly if you're a politician on the left, because that smears anyone who's on the right of politics, including the centre-right. But they're a bit squeamish about Islamism. How do you see this, particularly with concern for some time there about legal and illegal rates of migration?
Well, I think your conversation with Nick Cater nailed it. It is that there has been a concern for a long period of time among the populace about mass immigration and the way that's changing their communities, the way that it threatens some people's jobs. It's been dismissed by the people running the countries because they don't live in the frontline suburbs. They don't see how this bounces. They're not in the western suburbs of Sydney and see how communities change. And that doesn't mean that Australians are essentially racist or that Brits are essentially racist. It just means their communities have changed really rapidly in their lifetimes, and they see now a group of people in their community who they don't believe ascribe to the same values as they do. They are patriots and they are concerned. Now, that does not ever condone any violence at all against other communities or specifically against the police, as we've seen in the United Kingdom, and that is a right-wing movement that we're seeing on the rise. But Peter, we have to ask the question as to where did this come from? Where does this rage originate? Now, there is undoubtedly in some of these communities an element of racism in that, but there's a larger group of people who've been concerned about what's happening to their society, and they feel frustrated because no one ever actually listens to their concerns and nothing ever actually changes. So unless the people who are running countries start to get the message that there is a real and present danger in the policy settings that they've put in place, which is driving some people to these extreme positions, then there'll be no cure for it.
There was a really interesting piece written by your colleague at The Australian, Adam Crichton, about this, the dislocation between governing elites here and around the world, particularly in Western democracies, and the people who have to live under that rule. And that disconnect, he argues, is starting to break democracies, and it's seeing a big emergence of fringe parties on the left, on the right, which are undermining democracy.
Yeah, well, I've been away, and as you point out, I've come from Europe, and you can see the brittleness across all of these societies in the European Union, and of course in the UK's case now outside it. Yeah, we've seen some far-right extremism in the UK, but we've seen far-left extremism as well. And one thing I'll say to you, Peter, is going around a whole bunch of cities, Prague and Vienna and the northern parts and cities of Rome, the one thing I can tell you, when you're going through those cities that you see is the police vans outside the synagogues, because the main threat of violence in Europe now to a particular community is the threat of violence by pro-Palestinian groups towards the Jewish community. And we're seeing again the rise of something that you and I would never have believed that we would see, is the anti-Semitism in Europe. So that, I think, is one of the principal concerns of communities in Europe at the moment. And it's attested to by the fact that there are police on the streets outside synagogues. And I think that is a terribly sad sign.
Great to have you back, Chris. See you next week.